Chapter 1. The Greek World. On his black warhorse Bucephalus, Alexander, king of Macedonia, rode at the head of his army. Unlike most of his soldiers, he had no beard. His skin was fair, and his light-colored wavy hair grew long and low on his neck. He was in India, and proud of the past few years. Finally, he had proved that he was the greatest general in history, and he now ruled the greatest empire that the world had ever seen. His soldiers had joined him from many parts of the world. There were Thracians, Macedonians, and Greeks from southeastern Europe, Scythians, Bactrians, and Sogdians from Central Asia, and Indians, riding their enormous armored war elephants. It seemed that no one could stop the march of this extraordinary army. Certainly not the Persians, who had once ruled much of Asia, but were now completely defeated by Alexander the Great. 2 centuries earlier, the Persians' enemy in Europe was Greece, not Macedonia. In those days, and during Alexander's lifetime, Greece was not a country. It was a collection of independent city-states, which shared a language, a religion, and a way of life. Athens and Sparta were 2 of the most famous city-states, but there were almost 1,500 others. They were not only found in the area that we call Greece today. Greek people lived in coastal areas all around the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. Naples in Italy, Marseille in France, and Izmir in Turkey all started life as Greek city-states. By 500 BC, the Greek city-states in Asia had lost their independence. They were under the control of the Persian Empire and had to pay high taxes to the Persian king Darius I. In 499 BC, they fought for their independence with the help of the Athenians. Unfortunately, they suffered a serious defeat. As punishment for this troublemaking, Darius decided to conquer the whole of present-day Greece. In 490 BC, he sent an enormous army to Athens, but the Athenians defeated it at the Battle of Marathon. After the battle, a messenger called Pheidippides ran straight home to Athens to tell everyone the good news. From Marathon to Athens was a distance of 42.195 kilometers. The same distance is called a marathon today, in memory of that great run. When King Darius died, his son Xerxes continued the war against Greece. In 480 BC, he sent another army, even larger than his father's one. It defeated the Spartans at Thermopylae, which means gates of fire, and marched towards Athens. The Athenians had to leave their city to escape the Persian army. While the Athenians were away, the Persians destroyed the buildings on the Acropolis, the religious part of the city. To the Greeks, this was unforgivable. But the Greeks soon made the Persians pay for their crimes. Athenian ships beat the Persians at sea in the Battle of Salamis, and then the armies of all Greece fought side by side to defeat the Persians at Plataea. Soon the Persian army returned to Asia. The danger had passed. But the Greeks never forgot that they had nearly become part of the Persian Empire. Although they had fought together in the Persian Wars, the city-states continued to be independent from each other. Some were ruled by a king or a small group of noblemen. Others, like Athens, were democracies and were ruled by the people. Unlike our democracies today, the ordinary people made all the political decisions. At least 40 times a year, they came together in enormous numbers to discuss and vote on matters of government, whether to go to war, when to have public holidays, or how to reduce the number of accidents at sea. Women could not vote, but the ordinary men of these Greek democracies had real power. Religion was an important part of Greek life. There were many Greek gods. Zeus was the king of the gods, and he used thunder and lightning to punish the people on earth and send messages to them. He had many children, and they too were gods. His son Dionysus was god of the forces of nature. His daughter Athene was connected with learning, and there were many more. All over the Greek world, people used to visit special places to ask the gods for advice. They asked whether they should start a new business or choose a wife. As city officials, they asked whether they should build a new temple or go to war. Communicating through religious officials, the gods gave them complicated answers that could often be understood in different ways. In the 6th century BC, for example, the Athenians sent officials to the Greeks' most important religious center, Delphi. They asked the god Apollo how they should protect themselves from attack by the Persians. and were told that they would be safe from the Persians behind a wall of wood. After much discussion, the Athenians decided that the wall of wood meant ships. They built warships and learnt to sail them. A few years later, they defeated the Persians at sea. The Greeks believed that the greatest heroes, like Hercules, went to live with the gods when they died. Ordinary people went to a dark place below the earth, called the underworld. Each Greek city-state was under the protection of one or more of the gods. Each of these gods usually had a temple, built in a style that has been copied in the Western world for almost 2,500 years. To keep their gods happy, the people of the city held regular religious celebrations. They brought gifts and performed special songs and dances. The Greeks are remembered for their love of the theatre, which they performed in celebration of the god Dionysus. The plays of great writers like Euripides are still performed today. Other forms of literature were popular too. The Iliad and the Odyssey by Homer were long poems which told stories about the heroes of the Trojan War. Other Greeks wrote beautiful love poems, and the Western world's earliest works of history. Philosophy was invented in Greece, and the work of Plato and Aristotle is still important today. The Greeks also made many discoveries in mathematics and science. Hippocrates, a doctor of the 5th century BC, is now called the father of medicine. Medical students all over the world have to promise to follow his rules for looking after patients. The Greeks thought it was important to exercise both their minds and their bodies. They were great admirers of physical beauty in men as well as women. The social center of a typical Greek city was its gymnasium, where rich citizens took physical exercise. Every 4 years, the city-states sent their best sportsmen to the city of Olympia for the Olympic Games. There, competitions were held in running, jumping, fighting, horse riding, chariot racing, and spear throwing. The greatest sportsmen at the Olympic Games became heroes of the Greek world, and were celebrated in poems by writers like Pindar. But the competition between Greek city-states was not always peaceful. There were often wars too. Except in Sparta, Greek armies did not have professional soldiers. The soldiers were usually farmers. Fighting took place in the summer months, and the soldiers went home in the autumn to look after their fields. The wars were usually about land. No city wanted other cities to control too much land or become too powerful. At the end of the 5th century BC, Athens and Sparta were at war for 27 years. It was a time of great suffering all over the Greek world. At that time, Macedonia in the north was not an important part of Greece. In fact, most Greeks did not think that Macedonia was part of Greece at all. The Macedonians spoke a strange form of Greek that other Greek speakers had difficulty understanding. Macedonian noblemen liked horse riding, hunting, eating meat, and drinking wine. They did not share other Greeks' interest in literature, science, and philosophy. Macedonia was ruled by a royal family that believed they were relatives of the great god Zeus. The king lived in Pella, Macedonia's capital city. The palace was as beautiful as the finest buildings in Greece, and the Macedonian kings wanted their country to be more Greek. They welcomed several important Greeks there, including many who were escaping the wars. The writer Pindar and the doctor Hippocrates were guests of the Macedonian kings, and Euripides wrote one of his greatest plays in Pella. And then, in 359 BC, Alexander's father Philip became king, and Macedonia's relationship with the rest of Greece changed forever. Chapter 2. A Macedonian Prince. Although Alexander's achievements were extraordinary, in many ways his father, King Philip, was responsible for his success. When Philip became king of Macedonia, he threw all his energy into increasing his power. He conquered the lands east of Macedonia, which were rich in gold. With this gold, he was able to pay for a full-time professional army, which gave him a great advantage over the part-time armies of the Greek city-states to his south. It was a well-trained, well-organized army, and soon it had defeated all Macedonia's neighbors. When he died, Philip's empire covered most of modern-day Macedonia, Greece, Albania, Bulgaria, and European Turkey. In Macedonia, men were allowed to have more than one wife at the same time. Philip had 6 wives. His first wife, his queen, and the mother of Alexander, was called Olympias. Olympias was a princess from the neighboring state of Epirus. She had a strong character and a quick temper. If she had a serious argument with someone, that person was unlikely to stay alive for long. There were many stories about her wild behavior and her love of the god Dionysus. In the Greek world, it was normal to kill a few animals as gifts to the gods. But when Olympias organized religious celebrations, thousands of animals were killed as gifts to Dionysus. Then Olympias and her friends drank the animals' blood. They played with poisonous snakes too. It was said that Olympias liked to sleep with a snake in her bed. It is not surprising with parents like this that Alexander was brave and adventurous. His teachers too helped to make him a strong and successful leader. His first teacher was a relative of Olympias, a man called Leonidas. Alexander hated him. Leonidas made Alexander exercise without having breakfast and gave him only a small snack for his evening meal. He even checked Alexander's school bags so Olympias could not hide food in them. Alexander loved music and literature, but his favorite hobby was hunting. He hunted with dogs, and he was always fond of them. Many years later, he even named a city in India after his pet dog Peritas. A hunter also needed a horse, and Alexander's horse was one of the most famous in history. A Greek friend of Philip bought it for an enormous sum of money and gave it to Philip as a present. Alexander, aged 12, went with his father to see this gift. It was a powerful black war horse, but it was wild. It jumped and kicked and turned. Nobody was able to ride it. When Philip ordered his men to take the horse away, Alexander asked his father to wait. He turned the horse towards the sun, so it could not see its own shadow. It immediately became less frightened. Whispering in its ear, Alexander gently climbed on the horse's back and rode it proudly round the field. Everyone was full of admiration. Philip, it was said, had tears in his eyes as he watched his smiling son. Alexander kept the horse, which he called Bucephalus, and for the next 20 years, man and horse were rarely separated. As Philip became richer and more powerful, he hired philosophers, artists, musicians, and engineers from all over the Greek world. His court at Pella was an exciting place for a young prince to grow up. Alexander could talk to people who had lived in Egypt, and made friends with a man who had been a governor in the Persian Empire. Macedonia was now well connected in the wider world. Philip was too busy leading his army to spend much time with his son, but he made sure that Alexander's teacher during his teenage years would be the best that money could buy. When Alexander was 13, his father hired Aristotle, a student of the great philosopher Plato. At that time, Aristotle was an unknown teacher with thin legs and small eyes. He also had one of the sharpest and most questioning minds in history. Aristotle later wrote many important works of philosophy. He was one of the first people to use scientific methods to learn more about plants and animals. He studied the stars and the way that the sea shapes the land. He wrote about politics and literature. The list of his interests and achievements is extraordinary. Nobody knows how much he taught Alexander. Aristotle later wrote that it was a waste of time teaching political science to a young man, because he has no experience of life and still follows his emotions. Was he describing his pupil Alexander here? Perhaps. But as Alexander grew up, like his teacher, he never stopped asking questions. Whenever Pella had visitors from other parts of the world, Alexander learned as much as he could from them. Alexander, like Aristotle, had a hunger for knowledge. Alexander was not Aristotle's only pupil in Macedonia. Aristotle also taught the sons of leading noblemen, and among them were many of Alexander's future commanders: Ptolemy, Perdiccas, Seleucus, Nearchus, and Alexander's best friend, Hephaestion. These friends, like the horse Bucephalus, followed Alexander loyally to the ends of the earth. Alexander grew up quickly into a responsible and intelligent young man. When he was 16, he was allowed to take charge of the government while Philip was away with the army. Soon after this, a tribe to the east of Macedonia started to cause trouble, and Alexander himself led a small army to defeat it. Then, when he was 18, he commanded part of his father's great army at the Battle of Chaeronea. In this battle, the Macedonians finally defeated the Greek city-states and forced them to accept Philip as their leader. Philip started to make plans to free the Greek cities in Asia from Persian rule. Alexander felt that he would have an important part to play in his father's war against Persia. The future looked good, but then his father fell in love. Eurydice was the daughter of a Macedonian nobleman. She was young and very beautiful. Soon, Philip was planning their wedding. Olympias was very angry because, as Philip's new wife, Eurydice would be more powerful than she was. And if Eurydice had a son, he could be chosen as king instead of Alexander. At the wedding, there was a big argument. Alexander attacked his father, although no one was hurt. Alexander and his mother left the court immediately. Alexander soon returned, but his mother went to live in her home country, Epirus. Without his mother, Alexander was very nervous about his position at court. Then he heard news that made him even more worried. In preparation for his war on Persia, Philip was in contact with the king of Caria, on the western edge of the Persian Empire, and the two rulers wanted to arrange a family marriage. As well as Alexander, Philip had another son, Alexander's half-brother, Darius. He had learning difficulties and could never be given adult responsibilities. Philip suggested that Darius should marry a Carian princess. Alexander could not understand why his father wanted this royal marriage for Darius and not for him. He sent friends to the Carian court to say that he would make a much better husband than his half-brother. The Carian king was pleased at first, but Philip was very angry when he heard what Alexander had done. He did not want to waste Alexander on a small country like Caria. Alexander's friends were sent away from Macedonia, and soon the Carian king got worried and lost interest in a marriage with anyone in Philip's family. Alexander had ruined everything. His position at court became even weaker than before. As Philip sent part of his army into Asia to start the war against Persia, he planned another wedding. Cleopatra, Alexander's sister, was marrying her uncle, the king of Epirus. All the local rulers in Philip's empire were there. But Olympias, who was Cleopatra's mother, as well as the king of Epirus' sister, was not at the wedding. Since he was joining the royal families of Epirus and Macedonia with this new marriage, Philip did not need Olympias and her Epirot connections. After the wedding, Philip was walking to the celebrations with Alexander and his daughter's new husband. His endless battles had left him with one eye and a bad leg, but he was still full of energy, dreaming of a successful war in Persia. Suddenly, a man moved towards them. It was one of Philip's bodyguards. Without a word, he pushed a knife into Philip's chest. Then he ran, but he fell as he tried to get on his horse, and Philip's other bodyguards soon killed him. There was no hope for King Philip. He was dead. Chapter 3. The Young King. We will never know why Philip was killed. He certainly had many political enemies inside and outside his empire who had the money to pay for his murder. Some people at the time said that Philip and his murderer had argued about a lover, but it is more likely that Olympias was responsible. Philip had not included his first wife in his plans for Macedonia's great future, so Olympias, quick-tempered and dangerous, had arranged his murder. She would have more power as King Alexander's mother than as King Philip's unwanted wife. But in Macedonia, rule did not always pass to the dead king's oldest son. At the time of his father's murder, many people did not want Alexander as their king. He was still only 20, too young, they said, to take on the responsibility of Macedonian rule. He was half Epirot, not a true Macedonian, because his mother was from Epirus, and his Epirot mother was wild and irresponsible, perhaps even her husband's murderer. There were two other serious possibilities for the next king. One was General Attalus, Eurydice's uncle, who wanted to rule Macedonia through Eurydice and Philip's new baby son. The other was Amyntas. 23 years earlier, Amyntas had been a child of 2 when his father, King Perdiccas, had died. Philip was Perdiccas' younger brother and had ruled in the place of his baby nephew. When Amyntas became an adult, Philip was so powerful and successful that nobody questioned his right to continue ruling. Amyntas was now 25. Compared to Alexander, he had the advantage of age and experience, and his blood was equally royal. He was popular with the noblemen of Macedonia. But Alexander stayed one step ahead of his enemies. He ordered the murder of Eurydice's baby, his own half-brother. General Attalus, who was with the army in Asia, could do nothing to stop him. Soon Attalus and Amyntas were murdered too. This was not unusual. In those days, the rule of a new king almost always started with a few murders. Alexander reduced taxes for the people of Macedonia, and since no other suitable kings were left alive, they seemed happy to accept him as their new ruler. The situation was more difficult abroad. When news of Philip's murder spread around his empire, the tribes in the north and the city-states in the south decided to free themselves from Macedonian rule. Within a few months of his father's death, Alexander had to fight to keep the empire together. He first went to the Greek state of Thessaly. The usual route was along a narrow valley in the mountains, but this was now guarded by the Thessalians. Alexander decided that it was too dangerous to take the Macedonian soldiers and war horses this way. Instead, he created a new path. He ordered the soldiers to cut steps in the steep rock face of a mountain on the border between Macedonia and Thessaly. After weeks of hard work, his army entered Thessaly by the new road, took the Thessalians by surprise, and defeated them easily. The Thessalians welcomed Alexander as their new leader. A march at lightning speed then took Alexander's army on a tour of Greek city-states. One by one, they realized that battle would end in disaster, so they quickly made peace with him instead. Only Sparta refused to accept Alexander as their leader, sending the message, "It is our father's habit not to follow others, but to lead them." Alexander was not too worried. The rest of the Greeks hated Sparta more than they hated Macedonia. He could manage without Spartan help. There were also problems in the north. After his tour of Greece, Alexander had to fight the Thracians, who lived beside the river Danube. They could not defeat Alexander's well-trained army, and soon they were forced to accept Macedonian rule. But bad news followed. The Macedonian forces in Asia were retreating. Attalus, murdered on Alexander's orders, had been a good general, and his death had probably weakened the army there. In Macedonia itself, Olympias was behaving typically and had murdered Eurydice. And in Greece, news was spreading that Alexander had been killed on the Danube. The city-state of Thebes was leading a new fight for independence, which was fast growing out of control. Alexander knew that he had to act quickly. He rushed his army to Thebes and started a siege of the city. When an unguarded gate in the city wall was found, the Macedonians soon forced their way into the city. Alexander called a meeting with the neighboring Greek city-states, who had for many years suffered bad treatment at the hands of power-hungry Thebes. When he asked them what should happen to Thebes, they voted to destroy it completely. Thebes came to a violent end. The city's riches were taken. A few houses were left untouched. 150 years earlier, the Theban writer Pindar had written poems for the Macedonian king, and now his house was safe. But the rest were burnt to the ground. 30,000 Thebans, including women and children, were taken prisoner and sold as slaves. The terrible news soon spread around Greece. No other city-state was interested in continuing their fight for independence now. Everyone rushed to prove that they were Alexander's greatest allies. At last, Alexander could turn his attention to Asia. It was time to plan his war against the Persian Empire. Alexander called together forces from many lands, foot soldiers from Illyria and Thrace, horsemen from Thessaly, warships from Athens, archers from Crete, as well as the highly trained Macedonian army. To this he added doctors, long-distance runners, engineers, religious men, specialists in digging for gold and jewels, and a historian called Callisthenes to record his great achievements. Alexander left his mother Olympias in charge of Macedonia, with his father's loyal general Antipater to lead her army. Then he marched to the Dardanelles, a narrow piece of water that separates Europe from Asia in present-day Turkey. While Alexander's second-in-command, General Parmenion, led the main army into Asia by the shortest sea crossing, Alexander himself decided to see some sights. His destination was the ruined city of Troy, scene of the legendary Trojan War, where Greeks and Asians had fought for the first time. The Greeks believed that the war had started 1,000 years before the time of Alexander, when Paris, a Trojan prince, stole the beautiful Helen from her Greek husband, Menelaus. Of all the heroes of the Trojan War, the greatest was Achilles. When he was a baby, His immortal mother had held his heel and covered the rest of his body in the water of the legendary river Styx. After this, he could only be hurt on his heel. Achilles grew up handsome and brave. At the start of the Trojan War, his mother gave him a choice. He could stay at home, live a normal life, and die an old man, or he could go to Troy, die young, and be famous forever. Of course, Achilles chose Troy. He was the fastest runner and the strongest fighter in the Greek army, but he also had a quick temper. After an argument about a female prisoner with his general Agamemnon, Achilles decided to stop fighting in the war. Without Achilles, the Greeks were nearly defeated. Patroclus, Achilles' best friend, fought in Achilles' armor to give the Greeks confidence, but soon he was killed by the Trojan hero Hector. Achilles felt very sad and very guilty. It was his fault that his best friend was dead. Dressed in new armor created by the gods, he returned to battle and did not stop fighting until he had killed Patroclus' killer, Hector. He tied Hector's body to his chariot and pulled it through the dust. But later in the war, Achilles himself was killed when Paris shot him in the heel with a poisoned arrow. This was a story that Alexander had read from his early childhood. He was even thought to be a relative of Achilles, through his mother Olympias and the royal family of Epirus. His teacher Aristotle had prepared for him a special copy of the Iliad, Homer's great poem about Achilles. This copy was so important to Alexander that he liked to rest his head on it when he slept. For many years people had compared Alexander and his best friend Hephaestion to Achilles and Patroclus. And now Alexander, like the Greeks of the Trojan War, had come across the Dardanelles to attack the people of Asia. As Alexander's boat touched the beach, he threw his spear at the ground as a sign that this land was now his. With his friends he walked up the hill to the ruins of Troy. He gave gifts to the gods. Then he and Hephaestion ran, Alexander to the tomb of Achilles, his best friend to the tomb of Patroclus. Next he went to the temple of Athene, where he exchanged his own armor for a shield, which, according to legend, had been used in the Trojan War. With his beautiful shield from the age of heroes, he went to rejoin his army as the new Achilles. We can only wonder if he thought about the choice of futures that Achilles had been given by his mother. Like Achilles, Alexander chose to fight battles and live famously. Did he guess that, like Achilles, he would never return to his homeland or live to middle age? Chapter 4. First Battles in Asia. Until Alexander could prove that he was stronger than the Persian Empire, the Greek cities in Asia refused to help him. He had very little food or pay left for his men. He needed to defeat the Persians in battle quickly, but the Persian commanders were discussing other plans. At this time, the soldiers in the Persian army were mostly Greek. People talk of Alexander's Greeks defeating the Persians, but there were 50,000 Greeks in the Persian army and only 7,000 in Alexander's. In Greece, it was difficult to earn a living if you did not own land. There were plenty of slaves, so landowners and businessmen rarely wanted to employ paid workers. The shipping business was a possibility, but storms at sea were common, and fortunes were lost as often as they were made. For many, the most attractive choice was a life in the highly paid Persian army. The army was full of failed Greek farmers and businessmen, younger sons who owned no land, and politicians who were not welcome in the city of their birth. A Greek general called Memnon had been responsible for the Macedonians' most recent defeats. He had grown up on the island of Rhodes, spent some time living in Macedonia, and come to Asia 15 years before Alexander. His wife Barsine was Persian, and he now owned a large farm, a present from the Persian king for his loyal service. Memnon now had a plan to defeat Alexander. The Persians should not face the Macedonians in battle, he advised. Instead, they should burn their own farms and make sure Alexander's army could get no food. If Alexander did not win a battle, the Greek cities would not help him. Soon, his hungry soldiers would have to return to Europe. The rest of the Persian commanders disagreed with Memnon. Instead, they decided to defend their country in battle. The Persian army grouped on the east bank of the river Granicus. When Alexander heard the news, he realized his luck and ordered his soldiers to march there as quickly as possible. Some of Alexander's advisors warned him that, for religious reasons, it was not a good month for a battle. Alexander acted typically. He created a new month. Alexander and his army reached the Granicus in late afternoon. The Persians had chosen their position well. The river was 20 meters wide and ran fast between steep, muddy banks. If Alexander ordered his army to cross the river, it would be easy for the Persians to cut them down in the mud. Alexander had read in the work of a Greek historian that the Persians liked to camp some distance from their chosen battleground, and did not march before the sun came up. The Macedonians crossed the river in the early hours of the morning, and found it undefended. They now had the advantage of surprise. Alexander led his horsemen against the enemy. The Persian horsemen fought back, but they were badly organized because of the surprise attack. When Alexander's spear broke during the fighting, a Persian commander saw his opportunity and struck Alexander on the head. But Alexander was not hurt, and before the Persian could strike again, a Macedonian called Clytus came to protect his king. Clytus's sister had been Alexander's nurse as a baby, and now Clytus saved his life. As the fighting continued, the Persians failed to organize a strong defense. Many of their commanders were killed, several by Alexander himself. Soon the Persians on horseback were retreating. As the Macedonians surrounded the Persian camp, about 17,000 hired Greek foot soldiers tried to defend it. They managed to hurt Alexander's horse, but there were many more Macedonian attackers. They could not hope to win. 2,000 were taken prisoner, and later sent to Macedonia as slaves. The rest were killed. Alexander used this cruel treatment as a message to other Greeks. Leave the Persian army and stop fighting your own countrymen. If you don't, your suffering will be worse than the Persians. After his success at the Granicus, the Greek cities in Asia quickly opened their gates to Alexander. He sent messengers to all the cities that he had already passed, telling them to become democracies, to create their own laws, and to stop paying tax to the Persian king. This was a clever trick, because it made Alexander popular with taxpayers. The tax to the Persian king was not really stopped, it was given a new name, and paid as a gift to the Macedonian army instead. But the trick was successful. The Persian-supported local rulers lost their power without any danger to the Macedonian army. The cities became democratic, and Alexander grew so popular that many people in the area started to think of him as a god. Alexander marched south into Caria, where he had in the past hoped to marry the daughter of his father's ally, the Carian king. At the border, he was met by Queen Ada, who had been the wife of an earlier king. Now she was almost a prisoner in her own home under the new king, a Persian called Orontobates. She had a strange suggestion for Alexander. He should become her adopted son and take Orontobates' place as the true king. But first, he had to defeat King Orontobates. Orontobates and General Memnon, who was then commander of the whole Persian army, were preparing a defense of Halicarnassus, now called Bodrum in Turkey. The city was famous for its mausoleum, the great tomb of Ada's brother, King Mausolus, which was one of the 7 wonders of the world. Halicarnassus had the strongest city defenses on the Asian coast, circled by walls and with a well-built castle. Persian warships defended it by sea. Alexander, who had sent his Athenian warships home a few months earlier because they were so expensive, had no warships at all. The siege was difficult. The Macedonians broke part of the city wall, but the Persians pushed them back. Many lives were lost from both armies. In the end, the Persians had too few soldiers to defend the city. They retreated to the castle, which they held for a year, but Alexander was able to move his forces into the main part of the city. As Queen Ada's adopted son, Alexander became king of Caria. Preparations now had to be made for the winter. Alexander decided to send home to Macedonia all the soldiers who had married just before the start of the war. This was a popular decision. Alexander's army now loved their leader more than ever. Alexander left his mother, Queen Ada, in charge of Caria. With the rest of the army, he marched to Gordium in central Turkey, and waited there for the return of the newly married soldiers. During the winter, Alexander became interested in a local legend. In Gordian's palace, which had in the past been the home of the kings of Phrygia, there was an old chariot. It was tied to a piece of wood by a complicated knot that no one had ever managed to untie. According to legend, Asia would one day be ruled by the person who could untie the knot. Alexander decided that he would untie the knot. In front of all his soldiers, he moved towards the chariot. After some minutes, the knot was broken. But there were two different stories from the people who were watching. Some said that Alexander's success with the knot was real. Others said that they saw him use his knife to cut it. We will never know. But that night, the gods seemed to send a sign of their support when thunder and lightning filled the sky. Word spread among his soldiers and the local people. Alexander, who had untied the Gordian knot, was the future ruler of all Asia. Chapter 5. Face to face with Darius. While Alexander was at Gordium, the Persians started to make more plans to defeat him. The Macedonians had no warships. The Persians had 300. It was time for the Persians to take advantage of their power at sea. Led by General Memnon, they took back the Greek islands of Chios and Lesbos. They planned to continue by sea towards central Greece, and they hoped that Sparta would soon lead a Greek independence movement against the Macedonians. If the Persians created enough problems in Greece, Alexander would have to go home. They also decided, finally, to burn all the fields before Alexander reached them, so his army would have nothing to eat. Marching south, Alexander found burning fields everywhere. Then, when he got to the city of Tarsus, in present-day southern Turkey, he became ill with a high fever, perhaps because of a swim in an icy river. His doctors feared for his life, but a Greek doctor called Philip, who had looked after Alexander as a boy, suggested a treatment that might help. As the doctor went to prepare the medicine, Alexander was given a letter from General Parmenion, his second-in-command. It said that Philip had been paid by the Persian king to kill Alexander. But when Philip returned with the medicine, Alexander drank it immediately, without questioning his doctor's loyalty. And after several weeks, he got better. In Alexander's world, death by poison was not uncommon, and the ability to know friend from enemy was very useful. Memnon was not as lucky as Alexander. While fighting on Lesbos, he suddenly became ill and died. This was a serious problem for the Persians. Without Memnon and his knowledge of Greece, they did not feel confident that they could fight a war successfully against the Macedonians in Europe. Although Memnon's plan had worked very well until then, they decided to change it completely. The great king of Persia, Darius III, took personal control of the situation. We know little about this king. Although he had royal blood, he was not a close relative of the Persian kings that had ruled before him. He had been the governor of Armenia and fought bravely in battles there. He had then become king of Persia after many members of the royal family were poisoned by a power-hungry politician called Bagoas. Persia itself was in present-day Iran, but the great king controlled all the lands from Egypt to Pakistan and from Uzbekistan to the Arabian Sea. His riches were legendary, and he received the treatment of a god. He was protected by a bodyguard of 10,000 soldiers. They were called the Immortals, because when one man died or became ill, his position was immediately filled by another man. The great king gave land to the men that served him well. The landowning Persians had a very comfortable way of life that was often a subject of wonder among the Greeks. They had soft carpets on their floors and beautiful gardens full of flowers. They ate the finest food, and hundreds of servants looked after all their needs. But with one word, the all-powerful king could take away their good fortune forever. Wide, well-built roads connected the great king's most important cities, Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis, with the far corners of his empire. The best of these roads was the Royal Road, which led 2,300 kilometers from Susa, in the heart of the empire, to Sardis on the Mediterranean coast. Every 25 kilometers along the route, there was a place to buy food and stay the night. Only the Greek cities in the west of the Persian Empire paid tax in the form of money. Everywhere else, tax to the great king was paid in food, in silver and gold, and in horses, war chariots, and fighting men. King Darius now put together an enormous army. Only the lands on the eastern borders of the empire did not send men. They were too far away to be useful. The Persian army's strength lay in its well-trained archers and horsemen, because riding and archery were the traditional hobbies of the Persian landowners. Tens of thousands of these men joined their king. but foot soldiers were less easy to find. Darius's army included a large number of teenage boys with no experience of battle. To help them, the king also called for the hired Greek soldiers who had been fighting with Memnon at sea. He needed them now for a great land battle. Historians at the time wrote that he had between 300,000 and 600,000 men in his army. But not all of them were soldiers. Each Persian horseman, for example, had 12 servants. And when the king commanded the army, his politicians, his wives, and his children came with him. The Macedonians, whose army only numbered about 50,000 men, received reports that the enemy had camped near the Syrian border with Cilicia, southern Turkey. They marched along the Mediterranean coast towards the Persian camp, covering the distance in half the usual time. Unknown to Alexander, the Persians had left their camp and were also marching. While the Macedonians followed the coast road south, the Persians followed the inland road north. Although they were only a few kilometers away from each other, neither army knew where the other one was. Such confusion is hard to imagine today, in a world where cameras in space can be used to spy on every movement that an army makes. The Macedonians realized first that the two armies had passed each other by mistake. They had already had several days of hard marching. Now, Alexander asked his soldiers to turn round and march again. After an evening meal, they marched north in the dark, had a short sleep, then marched again at first light. Around midday, they came to a river near the town of Issus. On the far side of the river stood the Persian army, on a flat piece of land about 2 kilometers wide. To the west, there was beach and the Mediterranean Sea. To the east, there were mountains. The fighting area was too narrow for Darius to take advantage of his greater numbers of soldiers. It was a good battlefield for the Macedonians. Alexander, riding Bucephalus, led a charge of horsemen across the river towards the enemy. The Persian horsemen rode to meet them, and the battle began. In the center of the battlefield were the Macedonian foot soldiers, who fought with 6-meter-long spears. Although they were difficult to defeat on flat ground, the Macedonians were having problems on the steep river banks. They were close to defeat at the hands of the hired Greek soldiers who fought for the Persians. But, just in time, Alexander's horsemen broke through the Persian line and came to help the foot soldiers. Soon, the Macedonians were winning the battle. King Darius was watching the fighting from his chariot. As Alexander and his Macedonian horsemen moved towards him from two sides, the eyes of the two kings met for a moment. Then, Darius, realizing that the battle was lost, turned his chariot and quickly retreated.
End of CD 1. CD 2.
Chapter 6. South to Egypt. Darius escaped over the mountains on horseback, leaving his spear in his chariot. But the Battle of Issus was a serious defeat for the Persians. Enormous numbers of Persians died. The rest of the Persian army broke into small groups, and most of the hired Greeks sailed home in Persian warships. King Darius lost much more than his soldiers and ships. The Macedonians found extraordinary riches left near the battlefield, and even more at the city of Damascus. There were 220 kilograms of silver, and as many gold coins as Alexander's father, King Philip, had received in tax from his empire in a whole year. There were piles of cups, bowls, and boxes made of gold. Alexander liked one gold box so much that he decided to keep his favorite copy of the Iliad in it. There were thousands of servants, including 329 female musicians, 319 cooks, and 70 wine waiters, who had come to look after the great king while he commanded the army. And, most important of all, the Macedonians took prisoner Darius's wife, mother, and children. Alexander made sure that the Persian royal family received royal treatment. They were given fine clothes and jewelry to wear, and had a comfortable place to live. Soon, Darius wrote to Alexander asking for his family's return. But Alexander replied that the royal family would only be freed if Darius called him King Alexander of Asia. "If you think you have a right to your empire, stand and fight for it," wrote Alexander. "Do not run away, because I will come after you wherever you go." Another prisoner was the dead General Memnon's beautiful Persian wife, Barsine. She had lived for a short time in Macedonia when her father, a Persian governor, had become unpopular with the Persian king. In Macedonia, Barsine had known Alexander as a boy, Now he was a man, and she was his prisoner. Alexander fell in love with her, and they were close for the next 5 years. Alexander now needed to take the ports in Phoenicia, present-day Lebanon. Most of them were happy to welcome the Macedonians and say goodbye to Persian rule. But the city of Tyre was different. Tyre stood on an island about a kilometer out to sea and was ringed by a wall 50 meters high. Few cities were as difficult to attack, but Alexander, as usual, wasted no time in worrying about the difficulty of his job. He told his engineers to build a wide road across the sea to the island of Tyre. Using stone from coastal ruins to fill in the sea, the first part of this road was built quickly, but the last 200 meters cost many lives. The Tyrians shot arrows at the Macedonians as they worked, but the Macedonians used stone-throwing machines to clear the archers from their shooting positions. The machines were also used to make holes in the city walls, but the walls were soon rebuilt. When the Tyrians sailed burning ships into enemy lines to destroy the Macedonians' wooden war machines, the Macedonians found other ways to destroy the Tyrian defenses. The Macedonians tried to climb the walls, but the Tyrians showered them with red-hot sand that poured inside their armor and burnt their bodies horribly. As time went on, Alexander was helped by other Phoenician cities, and by the Greeks who lived on Cyprus and Rhodes. More than 6 months after the start of the siege, the Macedonians and their allies attacked the island on all sides with ships and machines of war. Finally, Alexander and his soldiers managed to fight their way over the walls. The Tyrians defended themselves bravely, but the city was taken. 10,000 Tyrians were killed, and 30,000 were sold as slaves. The results of Alexander's siege can still be seen. Tyre exists today, but it is not on an island. The coastline was changed forever by the road that Alexander's soldiers built across the sea. South of Tyre, Alexander took the city of Gaza after a 2-month siege. The whole male population was killed. Then Alexander tied the feet of their dead king Bacchus to his chariot and pulled it round the city. His hero Achilles had done the same in the Iliad, with the body of Patroclus' killer Hector. Alexander then marched south to Egypt, a land rich in gold and farmland. In later years, when Rome was all-powerful and had a city population of 1 million, most of the Romans' food came from the valley of the Nile. The Egyptians were understandably proud of their long history. Their religion and their writing had begun almost 3,000 years before the time of Alexander, and their form of government had too. The Egyptians had built extraordinary tombs for their kings, or pharaohs. The greatest of these, the tomb of Khufu at Giza, continued to be the tallest building in the world until the 19th century. But when it was built in the 26th century BC, the Greeks had not yet even learned how to write. For centuries, Egypt had been one of the most powerful countries in the Middle East. But in 525 BC, it had fallen under Persian rule. Its people had never fully accepted this situation, and had regularly fought for their independence. Now they welcomed Alexander as their new ruler. They were deeply religious, and they saw that Alexander had a better attitude than the Persian kings to the Egyptian gods. They gladly made him their pharaoh. As pharaoh, he was believed to be a living god, son of the Egyptian creator god Amun. After spending time in Egypt's capital city Memphis, near present-day Cairo, Alexander traveled north to the mouth of the river Nile. There he organized the building of a new city, Alexandria. It was not the only city of that name. One had already been built near Issus, and before he died, Alexander built more than 20 others. But this Alexandria was perhaps his greatest gift to the future. In the centuries that followed, it became one of the Mediterranean world's most important centers of learning and of political and economic power. Leaving most of his army in Alexandria, Alexander traveled 200 kilometers west along the Mediterranean coast with a small group of soldiers. He came to the Greek city of Paratonion, then turned south into the Libyan desert. This time his destination was not an enemy city, it was Siwa, home of the Libyan god Ammon. Siwa, in Libya, was known all over the Greek world as a place where people could ask Ammon for advice and receive an honest answer. The answers were communicated to visitors by Ammon's religious officials. Ammon was connected with the Egyptian god Amun and the Greek god Zeus.